Heaven and hell suppose two distinct species of man, the good and the evil, but the best part of mankind float betwixt vice and virtue. This is a quote by David Hume, and one that was heavy on my mind for some time, not long after I killed my first man. And before I go any further, I am fully aware of how saying such things can draw suspicion, and even some attention to a person. And in a sense, the purpose of this episode is, in my mind, much greater than the risk that that presents. Um, I am aware and I am confident in the history that I have performed, and so this is the event that took place. I have actually pulled out a journal entry. It was June 23rd, 2010, on my second deployment, and the night it was a the it was an evening. It was a night raid, and the event was actually rather simple. I was a part of a Gustav team. We had fired. I was the assistant gunner. I was reloading. We were getting ready to reload, and there was a pause. The team leader chose to wait while he was fiddling with something on the Gustav, or not paying attention in front of us. A man stood up about maybe 75 to 100 yards away. We were using dual tube green night vision at the time. Uh, I think I had a PVS 15. I was using a PVS 15 dual tube night vision. And a man stood up about 75, 100 yards in front of us with an AK, pointed it right at us because he knew where we were at, because we had fired at him in his direction recently. And I raised my rifle and I shot him. That was really about it. Nothing interesting. I didn't really think about it much for some time because it was very uneventful. I put my laser on his chest and I pulled the trigger a couple times, and then he fell down, and that was it. And I didn't really think much of it because we had other things to do that night. We had to continue on figuring out where we were at and where our target building was, and we had all this other stuff going on. But for me, at least, like, there was a pretty tall berm off to the right, and I remember we fired the first round. I reloaded. The guy stood up, shot him, and then we finished. We actually unloaded the Gustav because we weren't going to fire a second round. I think so. And then we carried on. Like, the rest of the evening went on. And it was that was it. Then later that it would have been the next day, because we're really looking at days here. Um, the journal entry says, "Tonight is the night I'm supposed to have nightmares, which I doubt will come in any expected manner. More curious than worried about how my mind will react, I doubt it will alarm me at all. Hopefully this will turn over a new and better leaf for me." First Sergeant was certainly a very happy man about it. I was 20 years old, young guy. I remember listening to my grandfather tell stories about being in Korea in World War II, and suddenly, and perhaps more gently and yet unrecognized, I understood why he was so frank about it. He talked about warfare not in a sense of bravado, but in a pointed, matter-of-fact stance. It was very clear to him. It was very simple. And the reason why I started with this quote by David Hume, which I'll start again: "Heaven and hell suppose two distinct species of man, the good and the evil, but the best part of mankind float betwixt vice and virtue." And while at the time I was not really familiar with who David Hume was, I was not aware of Hume's fork, which we've talked about before as the is-ought distinction. And while I was not familiar with his writing, nor even how he approached morality, the quote was attractive to me because I was starting to think of myself as somewhat of a dichotomy. A person who desired to do good. I grew up in the church. I had a consciousness of right and wrong. I had a conscience. I thought about what was right and wrong, and doing the right thing was important. And I wanted to be a noble man. But then, even doing the right thing, for I believed that in some semblance joining the military was the right thing to do, It's not only something that I wanted to do, but there was mixed levels of desire involved in it. The the desire that was sort of, I don't think the word manifesting is the right word, but the desire, the idea, this world, kind of maybe even view of myself at the time that I had, was that I was a man who was sitting in a dichotomy. I was born of the light and existing in darkness. And it was kind of it's kind of a silly little poetic thing. You could even imagine, had I lived a different life, I might have been a very different person. Had I lived a different life and, you know, and become terminally online at the time, maybe I would have turned into a cringy neckbeard or something like that. But instead, I was here in the military on my second deployment, wrestling with and thinking about thoughts of death and violence and identity and who I was and what I was doing, and it was not an easy deployment for me. There was a man on my deployment who said something like, and I was reading through this kind of shocked by it, but he had said something like, I think it was something like, "Why don't you just die?" Um, which is a hell of a thing to say on a deployment to somebody. But he later on that deployment, he didn't. He was killed by an IED. So you have to wrestle with a moral position, a moral weight, uh, because a person who you might have believed to have mistreated you in the past is no longer there, and now you have to think about how you think about that. And that's not a very light concept. So it's just not a light concept. I think I can't. Nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. Uh, but I guess I should have found the notes on this before. Um, but the issue that it presented, and the point that I wanted to bring up this issue is that I wanted to talk about the concept of dichotomy and where it can be a pitfall for people. This one is a mix of experiences, arguments, and a worldview, changing perspective, and what ultimately is the intent of in this episode is to talk about moral foundations and where do we place and how do we understand morality, because it has consequences, and then I'll make an argument for what I think to be true. So at this time, this was again second deployment. I had just been we had been in a number of firefights at this time already. I was in Ranger Battalion. I had just been. This is the first time where I was ever in a situation where I and only I was the guy who shot at a person. So there was no ambiguity on it. It was a rather clear, clean, cut and paste, boring experience. Um, it was We all kind of knew what was going on, and the and soon after that, I was in this. I was starting to view myself as somebody who existed within dichotomy. I had, in me was both good and evil. There was this thing called war, and then there was this thing called virtue, or there was this sort of peace and war dichotomy, this good and evil dichotomy. And I had started drawing on it and writing on it and thinking about it as this sort of identity of who I was, and the identity itself um, had implications. You could describe it as a little bit of a dualistic perspective. I had taken on uh, premises uh, that were that I was not aware of. I had taken on premises that I was not sort of a conscious purveyor of. One of them being that violence might be a necessary evil. And so the realm of the dichotomy could exist very cleanly, because if war or violence was a necessary evil, but I desired to do good, and the only way to do good was to engage in the evil of war, then I was a person, or I could view myself as a person in desire of the good, but of willing, capability, and character to engage with that which was evil. And you see this motif through various forms of art or literature or culture, even culture argumentation. But what it ultimately boils down to is something similar to maybe uh, a Platonism or Platonistic. It's a very Platonist view, or even Zoroastrian, where you have the world in that kind of yin yang. You describe the world in this sort of yin yang, where there's good and there's evil, and there's good inside the evil, and there's evil inside the good. And ultimately, that washes out to a moral malaise of nothingness. But what in this time, it was a answer for me. And so the dichotomy that was going on at the time, this view of dichotomy, was one part of me was in pursuit of, or I was in pursuit of the good. And in order to accomplish the good, I might have to get my hands dirty. I might have to do some violence. I might have to learn about evil. And what the problem with this thing is, the problem with this idea of the dichotomy is it's very convincing, but it also provides an excuse, and it turns itself into an idol. In the Old Testament, Christianity in the New Testament, as well as in the Old Testament, is very, very specific about idolatry, and that it's no laughing matter. It's no light thing. Idolatry is the placing of something that should be that something as the creation, in the role of the creator. Idolatry is worshiping something other than God as God itself, whether it is a golden calf, or it is the government, or whether it is your own, or whether it is Moloch, or whether it is social justice, or whether it is one's own worldview or one's own intellectual prowess. Idolatry takes many forms, and while we like to engage in a form of chronological snobbery, assuming that the idolatry of the past was simply stupid people worshiping stupid rocks in the shape of other stupid people, that mindset, that again, this to use a phrase by C.S. Lewis, is a bit of chronological snobbery, and assuming that people who do not have the same technology as us are by nature, or by requirement, stupid. They don't understand it, that people worshipped a rock or an idol or a golden calf because they were too dumb to realize it. But then there's a problem in the Old Testament too, because when the Israelites were led out of Egypt and they were brought to Mount Sinai, they weren't done so by anything short of absolute miracles, whether it was the death of the firstborn, or the turning of the Nile to blood, or being led around by a pillar of fire and or cloud, or even, and I don't mean like a cloud in the sky, but like a literal pillar of fire at night, or being led by Moses, um, who was there when the Red Sea was split. It was split so that the people of Israel could get across the Red Sea, which is no small feat, and thus destroying the armies of Egypt. So these things, the people of Israel were not immediately aware that Moses had gone up Mount Sinai to essentially speak to God and receive something, direction in the form of the Ten Commandments. But they chose instead to go worship a golden calf. And one thing that is oftentimes a tragedy of our contemporary versions and pastors in Christianity, is that they either mysticize idolatry into some abstract, untouchable concept that is any sort of desire that isn't perfectly godly, or it isn't, or even, it's just some sort of mystical abstraction, or they turn it into, or we as a culture view idolatry as something as simplistic as considering a carving our god, totems and icons and otherwise. So we can get into division on those things. So dichotomy, though, and the reason why I am addressing this concept of dichotomy as being an idol, or functioning like an idol, might be better corrected to say something like a perverse worldview. a perverse worldview where that which is good is not given the credit for goodness, but rather only half of its sum. And that evil is given a portion of that goodness's power so that it may bear more weight than it ought to be given. To clarify a little bit, and I was engaging in this subject earlier, to make dichotomy one's idol, it becomes itself more important than both the light and the dark, an evil omen, a wicked flower. The light does not need to contrast the darkness to exist, even if we are more able to appreciate the light by contrasting it with darkness. So this is a subject of metaphysics, and this is an example that I want to pass on where philosophy, especially rigorous philosophy, not this kind of new age mysticism that masquerades as pseudo-intellectualism, where it comes to play in the mind of the warfighter and the man of valor, is that how we understand what we consider to be the good or just goodness in general has an impact on the world and an impact on how we act and how we make decisions. So I'm going to read on a little bit. It becomes idolatry when one attempts to create a third entity, a fusion of the light and the darkness. A distinction between Christianity and other religious worldviews or other worldviews is that it is not a dichotomy. That Christianity believes that at the very foundations of existence, there is the source of the good. And there is not a source of the evil in the way that is a perfect contrast to that. I go back to this idea of the yin and the yang, which is a good physical description, a good physical example of what a theology of Zoroastrian or dualism would look like, is that there is a God, and then there is an equal and opposite anti-God, or there is an equal and opposite evil God. This is also represented in some of Gnosticism, where you have the thing called the demiurge, and a modern recreation of Gnosticism in the form of the spiritual foundations of things like Black Lives Matter and the transgender movement suggest that this world is a prison created by the demiurge that is masquerading as God, but is in conflict with God, and we are stuck in the prison, which is sort of this combination of Zoroastrianism and Platonism. It's not all that really original, but once you get down to it, how else do you? It is the fundamental metaphysical requirement, the pre-existing requirement in order to achieve something like I was born in the wrong body. There has to be something that exists that is more real than the physical. And it's a challenge that we deal with. But in the world of dichotomy and this idea of dichotomy, and for the warfighter or the person who engages in violence, this is the person that I'm speaking to most today. I've got to read this part again. It becomes idolatry when one attempts to create a third entity out of a fusion of light and darkness. It is not easy. It is not an easy subject to speak about because of the how immensely personal it may be. But the dichotomy paradigm is not only a false god, but a path to suffering. The insistence of the subject begins with there being light and the dark, and it may assume that they are absolutes. So the absolute of the light and the absolute of the darkness. Let's just say the absolute of the light is God, and the absolute of the dark is the devil. We know through faith, and that only the light is absolute. This is a theological concern that goes back throughout millennia. Is that if God has an equal and opposite reaction, if he is bound by the laws of science, then he really isn't God. Because God would be the thing, the omnipotent, the ideal, the exact opposite of the limitations of good and evil. And in fact, God would be sort of the whatever it is that is God in a worldview is the thing which by which we understand goodness to come from. So this is the Euthyphro dilemma. Does God love that which is good, or is it good because he loves it? The only right answer is that goodness is that which God loves, or desires, or claims to be good. So, in this worldview, we might, in order for the worldview of dichotomy as identity to exist, one must believe that there is both an absolute in lightness and absolute in darkness, which is antithetical to a foundation which could exist within Godhood. In fact, Godhood would have to be something like the fusion of the light and the dark, but then it would be inherently self-contradictory. And so that would be a problem. And I think the certain proponents are going to have an issue with that, but we'll get through it. So the worship of this dichotomy betrays the light its due, because if you do not worship the light for being the light, if you do not worship God for being God, but for some other reason, then you are paying him less than what is owed, in a metaphor. It mistakes the righteousness for evil. It also, though, it mistakes righteous violence for evil, and this is where we get it. So where does this idea? Where do we often see this in the minds of the warfighter and the individual? That what is the foundation that gives grounds or reason to consider this dichotomy as being true? Well, what is something that we're taught about violence very often from a young age? Is that violence might, if anything, be a necessary evil. That evil people do evil things in the world, and good people occasionally have to do evil things to evil people in order for the evil to not continue. This is a commonly held worldview, but it's not a commonly held worldview it should not be. It really should not be. It's a commonly held worldview, in my opinion, by people who have no business talking about violence, ethics, or even education. It's a very simplistic, simplified, reductionist worldview where I get to place it as something over there, as evil is something that I don't do and I wouldn't do. But if I had to, or if I found justification as, let's just say, a form of responding to oppression, then I could pull it out at any given time and be given ad infinitum justification for its application. To make that sound less pretentious and philosophical, the problem with this idea that violence is a necessary evil, that it is an evil that we must engage in to limit other evil, is that it gives the person who wields the necessary evil an infinite justification so long as he's doing it for whatever he perceives as the good. So you might say, I am saving the human race by killing 1/6 of it. Is it evil? Yes, I know it's evil. I know there's a lot of pain, but I'm still doing it for the good. You have an ends justify the means worldview here baked into the cake. And in a Christian theology perspective or Christian foundation perspective, you cannot rightly say that violence is a necessary evil, because God, the source of the good, is one who commands people in the past to engage in violence. So you have a double problem here. There is no good way to come to the conclusion that violence is a necessary evil. And in order for the dichotomy to exist, in order to hold the worldview of the dichotomy, you have to either believe that violence is a necessary evil, or some idea that carries the same weight must take its stead. And so what we see in the dichotomy, this view of the dichotomy, which I'm going to return to as the view of the dichotomy, is that inside of you is the force of the good and the evil, and that the right mix of those two has made you into what you are, and is something that you are supposed to be. That some people who desire to do good will engage in evil, and they will engage in evil because it is necessary, and that because it is necessary, in a sense, to accomplish something that is good. But if it, even in a utilitarian sense, if it accomplishes that which is good, wouldn't it also be considered good? The dichotomy model rests on this. Let's see. And it mistakes righteous violence for evil by calling it a necessary evil. Not only does this not hold up in a biblical consistency, but it sneaks in a premise about evil, which is oh so subtle, but also oh so nefarious. The dichotomy model rests on this. It relies on both considering the darkness to be absolute, and also that evil can be warranted if it is followed out for the necessity of the good. Either it is an ends justify the means worldview, or it is an alchemical fashion of replacing God's providence with some form of mysticism. When we do battle with evil, and we do so knowing it is evil, we are in service of the good. We are kept pure by God's guidance and mercy. And so in my past, this is another, I'm using this, I'm using actually some other notes of mine from a journal entry to build this argument. And yet I have fantasized, this is me personally writing, and yet I have fantasized about those of us who live in the lands between. We are not given over to war, but are foreigners in the lands of peace. We may mistake our place in the world with a we may mistake our place in the world with a theology, but these are not to be mistaken for one another. War and peace are not darkness and light. They are not themselves the good and the evil. To mistake war for evil to mistake war for evil is to lionize it as an abstract concept and an abstract contrast of the good. It is to claim that it is an essence inside a person, one that they may gain in action. But evil is sickness, shadow, the absence of life or health or God. And we do lie to ourselves when we attempt to make allowances for evil by claiming the dichotomy. Inside a man may be war and peace. A person may experience both, but it is not the same to conflate the dichotomy of war and peace with good and evil. For as a man endureth war, he does not necessarily take evil and good, and he does not necessarily intake evil and add it to his person. Know that evil is already there. Evil comes from man first. As man turns away from God, he tries to justify his rebellion. A man may experience war, he may know peace, but to replace war with evil is to give it a foothold in one's self. If violence is a necessary evil, then he, the man, may justify doing violence for the he may justify doing evil for the necessity of good. Be it theft or rape or murder, but if violence is neither in its essence good or evil, then acts of violence are judged in their morality by a standard. Was the violence justified? Was it righteous? And in there is no room for dichotomy. As it looks to the light, the source of goodness, and pursues it even as one walks out of the darkness. And on the battlefield, the dichotomy brings doubt. Righteousness brings courage. There is strength in the light and malice in the dark. Dichotomy, if misunderstood and thus idolized, weakens the warrior, for he does not truly believe in his cause. So the issue with dichotomy and this worldview of dichotomy might be a dualistic internal perspective, or applying the dualism within oneself into the universe as well, trying to reimagine the world in your own image. And what I mean by that is we understand what we are burdened with is trying to understand the world for what it is, not what we want it to be. We need to understand what the creation is, what the order of this universe is. And then from there, we try to align our desires with the source of the good. This is what religion is, whether you consider yourself atheist, agnostic, Christian, Muslim, or whatever. What we're doing when we live is that we are using the physical world, our senses, and our scientific method to understand the context within which we make moral decisions. The difference is that the context itself is not the moral decision. And so it is our religion, our religious worldview, which informs each and every one of us what that morality is. What is the right thing to do? We all have it, whether we claim it or not is irrelevant. We all have a rubric, a system by which we make moral evaluations. And what I'm arguing with is what I'm arguing against is this idea that within a person may reside a dichotomy. Or if one idolizes this concept of the dichotomy, they have a worldview that is off kilter, off center. It is missing the mark. For those who are Christians, it is a sinful idolatry to think that oneself might be so important that they can bear the weight of the world, the sins of violence itself and war, for the sole purpose of the redemption of mankind. That is not our place in this world. Our place is to be like Christ, to pursue him, to pursue that which is good. We may sacrifice ourselves for one another, but we are not to make ourselves as stand-ins for Christ. We are not the same as him. We're supposed to be like him and make ourselves like him. And for the atheists in the chat, like, let's do this, I guess. Don't it's very odd and kind of comical when you hear somebody say things like, well, Jesus said turn the other cheek. Yes, I'm very aware of this. I've read the scriptures. I spent plenty of time reading it. That's one verse that's spoken in context from a Christ who says many things. And for us to sort of hinge our entire identity on a misquoting phrase of a single word and not even pull it from the Greek or whatever you want, it's not really the argument you think you're making. But that's me just being a little sparse at the time. The point with this dichotomy is that whether it's in art or whether it's in perspectives or whether it's how we've thought about it in the past, is that you come to realize that dichotomy is believing that oneself can carry the dichotomy of both good and evil, as if you can carry it, you can embody both, is a worldview that weakens you in decisive moments. If you are talking about very specific things like the battlefield, holding a dichotomy as a worldview weakens your faculty to make wise and accurate decisions. It's not the opposite of dichotomy is not naivety. There in sort of a factor there really isn't any opposite of it, because this is sort of a Hegelian concept here, but the opposite of dichotomy is distinction. Let's just say that there is the good and understanding the good, and there is the pursuit of the good. And though we have evil in us because of our sinful nature, and though we have evil in us because we do sin, we are not trying to create a host body for both the evil and the good in ourselves. And we also can better understand the use of force, the use of violence, when we understand where we gain our foundation of morality. If we try to excuse that worldview with something as simple as a dichotomy, then what we do to ourselves is we actually weaken our capability of evaluating right from wrong, or perhaps more tragically, when we are faced with genuine evil, because we see reflections of it in ourselves, we do not have the decisiveness by which to dispatch it with proper violence. So, in conclusion, tying this all together, and why I started with a story that might be a little bit visceral for YouTube, or even whatever platform you're listening to this on, there's a worldview that one can acquire as they engage in beginning to understand violence, and that worldview is what I've referred to as the dichotomy. The sole concept, the foundational concept of the dichotomy, is that within you lives both good and evil, and more insidiously, that evil, that balance of good and evil, or that conflict of good and evil, is a end state that you will exist in. Rather, What should be our case is that we are not in pursuit of acquiring the dichotomy or living in that dichotomy. Rather, the objective, the goal, is to be in pursuit of the good, which informs us on how and when to engage in different forms of violence or different forms of activity. It is the foundation for which we live. And and I give my story, and I talk about my story in this sense because I have witnessed that moment of indecision ruin people, destroy their lives, or even cause catastrophes otherwise. And also, I have seen within myself that it causes pain. It is a distraction. It is an attempt to place one's self too high in the totem pole. So, if this has been useful, if this has been this is one of those stories about warfare and morality, which is a difficult but foundational one for how we understand the foundations of or where we place our foundations for morality. And I hope that if you understand this, that you are not I hope, but I hope that you have enjoyed this piece, that it has edified you, that you've been made better, sharper, stronger, and that you have gained something from that. So if you want to support us, whether it's as little as $5 a month, you can go over to redactedculture.locals.com, or and on that platform we have things like gear questions and live chats and heads up, like first announcements of various things. It's you know what it is. If you really want to be a part of the philosophy of violence and understand how we really think about it, go to our Black site, redactedculture.locals.com. It's going to be in the bio below. Or if you want to pick up some of our stuff from our shop, we do have a couple of surprise friend teleportation hats still in the making. You can head over there. That's going to be redactedllc.com. But I appreciate it. You can join our newsletter. You can share this with your friends, and you can share this with other people who you engage with if you are in a group that is concerned about the potentialities of violence. This is written and given for men's groups at churches. This is given for pastors who are concerning themselves with violence, from one theologian to another. And this is written for or given for those whose daily employ requires the potential of violence for them. And as the world changes, I expect many of us will be in that camp, whether by employment or otherwise. So keep it up. This is the Redacted Culture Cast on killing and dichotomy as idolatry. Go forth and conquer.